Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing really well. And we're on our story tonight, part 3 of it, our story, and obviously this is about a camping trip to the Ozarks, which is a very magnificent part of the world. And if you've been there, let me know about it. So before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 3 of our story tonight. Jake raised a brow, and then he looked directly at Iris and said, "So you put on a brave face, do you, when you go on Uncle Ken's holidays? Is that right, Aunt Iris?" Jake finally met Iris's gaze, which seemed to be like the first time in many months, and Iris suddenly felt quite taken aback by the intimacy of this extraordinary moment. "That's right," said Iris, who was trying to hide her bewilderment that her nephew Jake was talking so gregariously this evening. There was no doubt in her mind a spark had gone on inside him at the mere mention of the intrepid camping trip, almost as if the adventure of going somewhere remote was an exhilarating prospect to her nephew. "I'm afraid I'm very different to your Uncle Ken in that regard, Jake. I am a lot more extravagant. I like very expensive, over-the-top holidays, always where luxury and pampering is involved. But your uncle loves roughing it, getting his hands filthy dirty. Do you like the idea of going camping to the Ozarks, Jake?" Jake's face once again lit up like a Christmas tree. "I think camping is so cool, really cool. My friend used to go camping every year, and he had so many stories to tell. I've wanted to go camping since I was little. But Mum, well, you know what she's like. She'd have hated camping, so I guess I knew it would never happen for me. She was like you, Aunt Iris. She likes easy-going holidays that don't involve many challenges, if you know what I mean. She likes taking things easy. Well, she did." Ken looked delighted to see that his withdrawn, somewhat subdued nephew was showing so much enthusiasm for the first time in months, and it seemed like the shy, rather withdrawn little hermit crab had finally come out of his shell. Ken began to tell Jake all about what they would ultimately be doing in the Ozarks, all about the fishing trips and the exploring, and it looked as if the heaviness that had weighed down on the young teenager's heart for so long had suddenly begun to lift like a hot air balloon in the sky. Ken was delighted to see such a shift in his nephew's demeanour. "Goodness gracious me," he said to his wife later, when they had got a quiet moment together. "Did you notice when I mentioned we were going camping to the Ozarks, how Jake reacted? I saw a whole new side to him. He brightened significantly, and for a moment I saw a regular teenage kid again, almost as if all the sadness he's been carrying around with him for so long, like an extra layer of clothing, he'd suddenly just shaken off." "It's the first time I've seen him like this in many months," Iris agreed. "To tell you the truth, I was completely taken aback by the transformation in him over the dinner table. He's been having therapy for many months with a counsellor, and I've not so much as seen a little smile on his face. And now at the mere mention of this camping trip, well, look at him. He's so excited, isn't he?" "So it seems that not everyone believes my camping trips are such a bad idea after all. Jake is clearly on board with me about this trip. Don't get so pompous and so full of yourself, Ken. I'm quite sure Jake's enthusiasm won't last terribly long. When we arrive at the Ozarks and he's eaten alive by mosquitoes and has to collect firewood," said Iris scathingly, who struggled to understand how it was remotely possible that anyone could seriously enjoy camping. "I hate to inform you of this, Iris, love, but some of us enjoy getting close and snug to nature, and we're willing in the process to put up with a few mozzie bites," said Ken, stifling a laugh. "Your problem is, Iris, love, is you enjoy being cushioned by the lap of luxury.
Jake is a young man after my own heart, and a lot like me it would seem, and I can see he's going to thoroughly enjoy going fishing and exploring. Without wishing to sound immodest, Iris dear, I would put my money on the fact that Jake will infinitely prefer my holiday this year, camping at the Ozarks, than your over-the-top holiday next year, where, knowing you, we will be lightly sunning ourselves on some exotic beach, drinking back cocktails. Don't be ridiculous, Iris had snapped. For a start, you don't know where we're going on holiday next year because I haven't told you. And let me tell you something. Jake is going to infinitely prefer my holiday over yours. I'm quite certain when we set up camp in the Ozarks that young man is going to feel quite miserable. I mean, what is nice about roughing it? No lovely hot showers, lying on hard ground, cooking over a gas canister in the morning and the fire pit at night. There is nothing remotely glamorous about such a holiday. Glamour is overrated, sweetheart. I think Jake is going to love every second of our holiday in the Ozarks, said Ken very confidently, giving his wife a mischievous wink. Just you wait and see. Iris realized, much as she hated admitting this to herself, of course, that her husband Ken was absolutely right. Jake was in his element. He was definitely having the time of his life out here in the Ozarks. And when they'd set up camp in the middle of nowhere, he appeared to be exceedingly delighted about the solitary loneliness of their location. She had watched him staring at the views, with an expression of unbridled awe on his face, as if he'd never laid his eyes on anything more beautiful. "This is so cool, Uncle Ken. Thank you so much for bringing me here," he said appreciatively. "I've never been anywhere more lovely in my whole life. The trees, they're so lofty. The views are spectacular. Sorry, Aunt Iris, but this holiday is going to be hard for you to beat." "Is that right?" said Iris, raising a brow. "We'll see about that, shall we?" It would seem that since they had pitched their tents out in a sequestered part of the Ozarks, that Jake had really come out of his shell this time. It was like the Jake that had hidden his light under a bushel for months on end had come alive on this camping trip. And Iris was extremely surprised to find that she was thoroughly enjoying the young teenager's company. How was this even possible, she wondered. Jake had given her a helping hand with the cooking and made himself extremely useful around the camp. The realization that she was actually enjoying his company annoyed her significantly, because she'd always believed she could never relate to a youngster like Jake. But she realized she had more in common with him than she had fully appreciated. Jake had been delightful on this camping trip, always volunteering to help wherever he could, cracking jokes and ensuring that everybody was having fun, to such an extent that if Aunt Iris were to be brutally honest with herself, she would have been forced to admit that even with the mozzies feasting on her skin, this was the first camping trip she was actually enjoying. And this was down to Jake, making the experience pleasurably memorable. She had underestimated that her nephew's presence in her life might actually be a blessing, rather than the curse that she had assumed it would be. "I'm sorry, Aunt Lily," Jake said very politely, as he helped her place the sausages on the griddle pan over the gas hob. "It can't have been easy for you taking me in, but I really appreciate that you didn't put me in foster care. I would have really hated that. I know I haven't exactly been very talkative over the last few months. It's all just been so daunting, so hard, you know, losing Mum and all that. I suppose I've been trying to process it all over the last few months, and I still can't get my head around what she did to herself." "But of course it's been hard, Jake. Goodness gracious me, don't you dare apologize for that. I can't imagine what hell you've been through. For the record, I think you've been incredibly stoic, very brave and courageous for a young man such as yourself. Losing a mother must have been grievously hard for you. It must have been like having the rug pulled out from under your feet." "But I can't believe she did it, Aunt Iris," said Jake, turning the sizzling sausages that were splattering in the fat around with the tongs over to one side,
after they'd browned evenly. "I just don't understand why she did it. If I had known, I would have—" "I know," Iris said sympathetically. "I know what you are trying to say, Jake," she said, the sympathy beginning to burgeon in her heart. She was so touched that he was sharing his feelings with her, in such an adult, very intimate conversation. She suddenly impulsively reached out to touch Jake on the arm. I know, love. We're all angry with ourselves for not reading the signs that your mother was in a bad place. Had we known she was going to swallow a whole bunch of pills, we'd have stopped her, wouldn't we? But none of us could have ever anticipated this happening, could we?" "I know why she killed herself," said Jake candidly. So much so that it took Iris aback. "It was because of Pr. I always knew he was a rat. And not just any rat, Aunt Iris, because there's a difference, believe me. Pr was a sewer rat. And let me tell you, Aunt Iris, they're the worst of the worst. And you know why? Because they have no moral compass whatsoever. They just go where the wind takes them, not caring who they hurt along the way. I told Mum not to get involved with Pr, most specifically, after she brought him back to the apartment one evening to introduce him to me. The next day, would you believe it, he had moved in permanently and made himself ever so comfortable in our apartment. Mum wouldn't listen to my warnings. I knew what he was like from the moment I met him. I didn't have a good feeling about him at all, but Mum wouldn't have a bad word said about him. She naively believed the sun shone out of his backside, and she was so beguiled and so seduced by that thick over-the-top French accent of his." "You told your mother you didn't like Pr?" asked Iris, looking quite bewildered by this, and suddenly seeing a look of great anger rush over Jake's face. He pumped the air furiously with his fist, as if he was punching someone you couldn't physically see, an invisible foe, perhaps. But Iris knew instinctively the punch was strictly reserved for Pr. "I wish I could have punched his lights out, Aunt Iris," said Jake furiously. "I knew what he was doing," he said, his eyes now fixing on Iris's. "Pr was seeing another woman behind Mum's back. Her name was Cheryl. She was a brassy blonde woman. She dressed rarely cheap. You know the kind of woman. Everything hanging out for everybody to see. Pr thought I didn't know what was going on, but I'm not stupid, Aunt Iris. I may be 14 years old, but I'm not deaf, nor am I dumb or blind." "But of course you're none of those things, Jake. You're a very intelligent, wise 14-year-old boy, and probably even sharper and more astute than many your own age are." Jake suddenly lowered his voice to a whisper, as if he was sharing a secret with Aunt Iris that he wanted nobody else to hear. "Whenever Mum was away on a business trip, Aunt Iris, Pr would sneak Cheryl into our house. But before he did so, he'd make me a sedated hot chocolate. But I saw him putting the sleeping tablets into the mug of chocolate, so I never drank it. I guess Pr thought I was out for the count, when he was clandestinely entertaining his lady friend in our apartment. I knew exactly what they were getting up to in my mother's bedroom. They weren't exactly quiet about it. And Cheryl, well, she laughed like a cackling witch. I could hear her cackles at the far end of the apartment. She was such a noisy woman." "Oh, I'm so sorry, Jake, to hear all this," said Iris sympathetically. "You didn't need to have your nose rubbed into that. The man was despicable, bringing another lady into your mother's apartment when you were there. What was he thinking? Shame on the man. It was an absolute disgrace. You're right, Jake. He was a sewer rat. That's a very apt description." "Aunt Iris?" "Yes, dear. What is it you want to tell me?" "Well, I wanted to tell my mother what was actually going on. I mean, with Cheryl and Pr. But every time I tried to tell her that Pr was doing the dirty on her, I just couldn't do it. I'd tell her I had something very important I needed to tell her, and she'd say, 'Go on, I'm listening. What is it you want to tell me, love?' And I'd look into her blue, sparkling eyes, and I just couldn't say it. I couldn't do it, Aunt Iris. I would say, "Oh, it's nothing, Mum." I knew if I told her the wretched truth, it would break her heart. So in the end, well, I decided not to tell her anything at all. I think I let her down, Aunt Iris. Maybe she'd still be here if I had confided in her about all of this.
Oh, goodness gracious me, Jake. Look what you're doing to yourself. This is not healthy. Don't you dare go blaming yourself for what Pr did to your mother. Do you understand me? This is not on you.
But I feel responsible, Aunt Iris. I should have said something, shouldn't I? I shouldn't have kept my mouth shut. I was so afraid to tell my mother the truth. I didn't want her to get hurt, because my mother's such a sensitive... Well, she was so sensitive.
Do you know what, Jake? I haven't got any answers for you, said Aunt Iris. But I do know one thing. None of this is your fault. I had no idea you knew about what Pr was getting up to behind your mother's back. Did you say anything to him? I mean, did you confront him about what he was doing?
Yes, I did, said Jake. I told him I knew what was going on, and if he didn't end things with Cheryl, that I'd tell Mum what he was doing.
And what did he say to that? Asked Iris, her eyes now growing round.
At first, Pr denied that he was doing anything behind Mum's back. Then I told him I knew what he was doing with my hot chocolates, and I told him I'd heard everything. So finally he admitted that it was true, that he was seeing this woman called Cheryl. But he told me if I told Mum about any of this, it would break her heart. And did I want to have that on my conscience?
Ah, so he cleverly manipulated you, did he? Said Iris, unable to hide the burgeoning disgust that was growing on her face. You know your Uncle Ken knew that Pr was no good. I'm glad to say your very astute, discerning uncle was not taken in by that man, but I'm ashamed to say I was completely seduced by that incredibly sexy French accent of his. What an idiot I was.
Well, that's because most women are taken in by him, said Jake matter-of-factly. They don't know what a snake in the grass he actually is. I just wish I had told my mother, Aunt Iris, what was going on. I wish I wasn't such a wimp. I never expected my mother to come home a day early from her business trip, and then to find Pr sleeping in her bed with another woman. It never ever even crossed my mind that something like that would happen. I can't imagine what it must have been like for Mum to walk in on that scene. But I know what happened, and I guess Mum just lost it when she finally found out what had been going on behind her back all this time. My mother's always been emotionally fragile, Aunt Iris, but I know you know that already. She's the kind of person you treat very gently, with kid gloves, like a piece of fragile porcelain, if you know what I mean.
I'm well aware of how fragile your mother was, Jake, so I can't imagine how dreadfully upsetting and very distressing it was for her to return home from her business trip, to walk into her own apartment, into her own bedroom, and to be confronted with such an abysmal scene. I can't imagine, said Iris, shaking her head furiously.
I know Pr's cheating was what made my Mum overdose on pills. I know that's the reason she's dead, and I blame him. He's the one that killed my mother. He's a murderer. He's a murderer. He killed her, Aunt Iris.
Well, your mother was a very sensitive soul, wasn't she, Jake? As you were saying, it was all too much for her. In the heat of the moment, I think she was overwhelmed by the horrifying discovery that made her feel hopelessly insecure and vacuously empty, as if everything she had ever known and loved had crumbled in her hands rather like a cookie. Sometimes, Jake, in a moment of desperation, when you feel that you've lost your anchor in this world, you can be tempted in that moment, in that second, to overreact. When you feel as if your life has come to a crashing end, Your mother just grabbed a bunch of pills without really thinking about what she was doing, and I'm sure that was the case. And Ken, your Uncle Ken, definitely believes that. And in that moment she decided to anesthetize herself. Perhaps she even wanted to die. But I am certain that in the cold light of day she wouldn't have made such a foolish, impulsive decision, because she wouldn't want to leave you, Jake. Of that I am most certain. Your mother went to the ends of the earth to fall pregnant with you. Let me tell you, she would never have willingly left you like she did. What she did was just purely impulsive.
Mum could get very overwhelmed, said Jake. I think you're right, Aunt Iris. She impulsively took those pills, not thinking about the consequences of her actions. And you're right, she'd have never wanted to leave me, because she loved me too much. I did know that Cheryl was in our house that night, and I was so angry, because the one thing that Pierre had promised me was that he'd never bring Cheryl back into our apartment. But he did. I couldn't believe he'd broken his promise to me like that.
And you did nothing about it?
No, I did nothing about it. I just couldn't, Aunt Iris. But I decided that when Mum returned from her business trip, I was going to tell her absolutely everything that Pierre was getting up to behind her back. I just couldn't go on any more seeing him humiliate her like this, rob her of her dignity and self-respect. I knew I couldn't let it go on for a moment longer. I had to put a stop to it. I went to sleep that night and woke up in the early hours of the morning to hear a huge commotion going on in the hallway. I could hear loud voices, lots of cursing and shouting, and Cheryl saying some cruel, nasty things to Mum, like,
Pierre loves me, and it's not you he loves. You mean nothing to him. If you want to know the truth, he's been using you all this time. Sorry to break it to you, love, but you're not all that, and Pierre's not into you. Tell her the truth, Pierre, that you don't love her, that you love me. Go on, do it. She might as well hear it from the horse's mouth, don't you think?
I heard Pierre pleading with my mother and saying,
Don't listen to a word that Cheryl is saying. She doesn't know what she's talking about. It's you I love, Tina, only you. There's never been anyone else but you. I just got a little lonely while you were away, that's all. So I brought Cheryl into the apartment, just for a little fling, but it meant nothing.
Of course, when he said that, Cheryl was very indignant. She began to scream at him.
Why are you lying to her, Pierre? Why are you telling her porkies? The cat is out of the bag. You might as well tell her the truth. Tell her exactly what you told me. Tell her how pathetically needy she is.
That was when I heard my mother scream,
Get the hell out of my apartment. I never want to see either of you ever again. Do you understand that?
Mum began to throw Pierre's shoes and clothes at him. I've never seen her look so furious. I was standing secretly behind my bedroom door, watching the whole thing transpire. I think Pierre was very shocked by my mother's indignance, because Mum's such a gentle person normally. It took a lot to make her angry. I remember Pierre looked so pathetic, Aunt Iris, standing there in the hallway completely naked. He was getting his clothes thrown at him by my mother. He must have been so humiliated, eating all that humble pie, so to speak, while Cheryl had to call an Uber taxi to take them back to her apartment. Pierre was begging my mother to listen to him, but my mother told him there was nothing to say. She'd seen enough.
Good for your mother, said Aunt Iris approvingly. At least she stood up for herself, Jake. But no doubt she was absolutely devastated by what had just happened. And, of course, hearing Cheryl telling her that Pierre had only been using her all this time. That must have hurt her like hell.
Oh, it was too awful for words, Aunt Iris. My mum was so crushed. I could see the despair in her face. Of course, Pierre was all over her, trying to worm his way back into his life. He had no shame. He kept telling her how much he loved her and how he didn't really love Cheryl. I think he realised his gravy train had come to an abrupt end, and he didn't like the thought of that. You do realise, Aunt Iris, Mum paid for everything in their lives. Pierre contributed to nothing. He never even tried to look for a job. He told my mother he'd be in touch when she finally calmed down. That night after they left, my poor mother crumpled down at the foot of the stairs. She began to sob her heart out. I'd never seen her so distressed before. I so wanted to go over to her, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be all right, and that she was, well rid of that scoundrel, so to speak. But I couldn't do it, Aunt Iris. I didn't know what to say. In the end, I thought maybe I should give my mother some space, to let her come to terms with what had happened. Eventually, my mother got up from her position on the floor, and she went up the staircase. She ascended the staircase with a heavy heart, like an old woman, if you like, as every step was like a burden for her to overcome. I returned to my bedroom and couldn't sleep for a long while. Then I heard these loud thumping sounds that were coming from the upstairs window. So I looked out of my window, and there I saw all of Pierre's clothes and shoes and everything he owned being thrown out of the window by my mother and lying draped over bushes and all over the front yard. In that moment I remember smiling. I was proud of my mother for doing that, getting rid of everything that was connected to that measly man. I think it was some kind of a release for her. I thought she'd probably cry into her pillow and feel a little better the following morning. But then I found her,
I know, Jake.
Jake began to sob as he recounted how he'd found his mother in the early hours of the morning, lying on her bed completely lifeless, with a whole lot of pill bottles surrounding her. Iris spontaneously threw her arms around her nephew as he sobbed into her shoulder, and she suddenly felt such tenderness for the young man that she'd initially almost despised.
"It's all right, Jake," she said, patting his back gently. "Get it all out. It's very good to cry, It's a release, and you should have done this a long time ago. Crying is one of the best things we can do for ourselves."
Jake's eyes glistened with tears as he finally calmed down and looked at Iris with so much regret in his eyes, almost as if he wanted to go back in time and undo everything that had happened, but that was not possible.
"Oh, goodness gracious me, Jake, look at you. You're blaming yourself for what happened, aren't you? You're feeling guilty about not reaching out to your mother after she learnt the brutal news. Is that right?"
Jake nodded. "Why didn't I go and comfort her, Aunt Iris? Maybe if I'd done so, she wouldn't have taken those pills, and then she'd still be alive, and then none of this would have happened, Aunt Iris."
"I'm not sure that this would not have happened, love. I think your mother intended to take her life in that impulsive moment, and I really don't think anybody would have been able to have changed that for her. I don't know if you know, but your mother phoned your Uncle Ken at 2 o'clock in that morning after she'd thrown Pierre out of the apartment. She was in a right old state on the telephone, let me tell you. I know because I was thrown out of my sleep because she was sobbing so much. She was inconsolable with grief, telling your Uncle Ken how much she loved Pierre and how she'd always believed he was the one for her, and how all her dreams for the future had been fully shattered. She told your Uncle Ken she'd always thought Pierre had loved her, but now she knew differently. She knew he'd been using her all this time, that he was a freeloader who just wanted her money and never wanted her. Anyway, your Uncle Ken told her very reassuringly that she was well rid of the man, and she deserved so much better. Your mother knew your Uncle Ken never trusted Pierre as far as you could throw him. He had warned your mother hundreds of times, not to go out with the man, but your mum was like a lamb to the slaughter. She failed to see what a tow rag that man was. But your mother always saw the best in everyone, didn't she? By the end of that telephone call, your mother was talking in a futuristic tone of voice. She was saying things like, "I'll never go on a dating website ever again," and stuff like that. Not the kind of words you'd expect to hear from someone that is intent on taking their own life. Her responses seemed somewhat healthy, although bizarrely at the end of that telephone call she did say to Ken that he mustn't forget how much she loved him. At the time those words were not a red flag to Ken, but now your uncle wonders if you know that she was planning to take her life after the phone call had been completed, as if she'd called him up to just say goodbye. At the time I thought Ken had done an excellent job in calming your mother down. If your uncle had believed for a single second your mother was at risk at taking an overdose of pills, he'd have done something at once to stop her. So I very much doubt any comfort you could have offered your mother would have made any difference, if that helps at all, love.
Iris noticed an immediate relief washing over Jake's young face, almost as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. If Uncle Ken couldn't talk Mum around, if he couldn't succeed in calming her down, then I certainly couldn't have done so, said Jake very solemnly. Mum always listened to Uncle Ken.
There you go, then, said Iris, smiling warmly at her nephew. So you see, none of this is your fault, Jake. I won't lie to you, Jake, because we're both being very straight with each other. Hand on heart, I hasten to say when your mother took her own life, I thought it was the most selfish thing of her to do, especially given she was leaving you behind. But your Uncle Ken has made me see that when your mother was overwhelmed, she went into a headspace that made her react impulsively without much due thought. And I believe that that is what happened.
Uncle Ken is right. I've always given Mum her space when she's been upset about stuff. But the truth is she's always overreacted. And I guess when she found Pr in that compromising position and realised he'd been unfaithful to her, it was just too much for her to bear.
That's why you cannot afford to blame yourself for what happened, dear. Do you know your Uncle Ken told me that your grandmother would say that your mother was too sensitive for this world when, she was growing up as a girl.
She was way too sensitive for this world, Jake agreed.
How is the counselling going, Jake, if you don't mind my asking you? Has it been helping you deal with your mother's loss? I'm sorry I never asked you before, but it was just awkward for me to address the subject.
To tell you the truth, Aunt Iris, the counselling hasn't helped at all, said Jake candidly, making a face. It's been pretty useless, actually. A complete waste of my time. I've never been a big talker, you see. I like to keep my private thoughts to myself. So when I go and visit the counsellor, I never actually say anything during the sessions. I think the therapist was increasingly frustrated with me. She kept saying, Jake, if you don't talk, how can I help you? Stuff like that. But I think coming here to the Ozarks has helped me in a way the therapist never could. I think being here with you and Uncle Ken has made me feel alive for the first time in ages. I'm beginning to feel like myself again.
Good, I'm very glad to hear that, said Iris.
Oh, Aunt Iris.
Yes, what is it, Jake?
Asked Iris tenderly. The hardness she had once worn on her face had completely dissipated. She had found herself feeling such warm, tender feelings towards her nephew. I don't know how to say this, Aunt Iris, because I don't want to put you on the spot, or make you feel uncomfortable or bad, and I certainly don't want to embarrass you. But I know you haven't liked me staying at your home.
What makes you say that, Jake?
Asked Iris, her face colouring in embarrassment, for she knew only too well that she had done little to make poor Jake feel welcome since he'd moved in with them, and now she was riddled with a self-recriminating guilt. What an idiot she had been to treat her nephew so abysmally in the beginning. She felt an immediate sense of shame about everything she could have done over the last few months to help Jake settle into their home, things that she had failed to do, simply because of her resentment. Just so you know, Aunt Iris, I'm going to be completely straight with you. I don't blame you for being mad at me. You didn't expect me to be thrust upon your life so abruptly, like I was. My mother told me you never wanted children. I could feel when I moved in that I was in your way, and that you weren't happy having me around. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry you've had to put up with me. I wish things had been different for you. But honestly, I'm so grateful you took me in. I really am. And I'll try my best not to be too much trouble to the both of you. Iris felt her skin crawling with shame. Jake was such a sweet, sensitive teenager, and she had treated a young man suffering from so much inner turmoil with such disdain.
I am so sorry, Jake. I'm very sorry for everything. What can I say? I should have made you feel welcome in our home from the very start. And I didn't, and I really apologize for that. I was so bitter, so resentful, like an insufferable bear with a sore head when you first arrived. I was mad that you had been thrust upon our lives like this, which was extremely selfish and self-centered of me, because you are family, and you're very important to us. If the truth be told, I'm really enjoying your company here at the Ozarks. Normally when I come to the Ozarks, Jake, I have the most abysmal time. But since you've been here, with your sense of humour, I've been enjoying myself, and that really is something. I realise that you are a gift to our lives, that you've been a blessing that I've failed to see until now. I'm very glad you're here.
You're not just saying that to make me happy, are you, Aunt Iris?
Of course I'm not just saying it. I do realise, Jake, what a mug I've been. I'm going to thoroughly enjoy you living with us from now on and being part of our family. And I want to make sure you feel very welcome and very at home. I hope that you and I can be best friends from now on.
Jake nodded and gave Iris a broad grin, and the two of them embraced, just when Ken came back from the woods with a big basket of firewood in his hands. His face looked a little bemused, as if he was perplexed by something. Then he looked up to see Jake and his wife talking happily together, so his face broke out in a broad grin. He was extremely glad to see the two of them appeared to be hitting it off. It was almost as if his wife's previous resentment towards Jake was beginning to vaporize and wear thin, so things were looking a lot more upbeat for the future.
It's good to see the two of you having a nice chat together, he said. You were back quick, said Iris, quickly changing the subject. That's it. Very bizarre it was, said Ken, his brow furrowing deeply. It didn't take me long to gather the firewood, did it? As I say, it is completely bizarre. There is no other appropriate word for me to use in the circumstances. What is bizarre? Asked Iris, looking at Ken and his bemused expression, and wondering what on earth was up with him. Well, I was gathering firewood, wasn't I, in the woods? And I left my empty basket under a tree, and went off to gather a handful of wood. But when I returned with my handful, the basket had already been filled with wood, and I was not the one who filled it up. So the $120 question is, if I didn't put the wood in the basket, then who did? Well, maybe you did put it in the basket, said Iris, but you forgot that you did it. Sometimes people do things on automatic pilot, don't they? I often ask myself, did I lock the door or turn the oven off? And I have no recollection of whether I did it. So I go off to check, only to find that I did indeed turn the oven off, and I did lock the door. Maybe you filled the basket up with wood and forgot all about it, as you went off to gather some more wood. Maybe in your head you believed the basket was empty, so when you returned to find it full, you became rather confused. It happens, love. I wouldn't forget something like that, said Ken resolutely. I just wouldn't. You're not playing a trick on me by any chance, are you? He said, looking from Iris to Jake, as if expecting to see the two of them sniggering together. I'm being serious. I need to know. Is this some kind of weird practical joke that you conjured up between the two of you? To make me think that I'm losing my mind, perhaps? If it is, I want to assure you it's working. Come on, please don't pull my leg. Did you do this, Jake? He said, looking straight at his nephew, to see if Jake was trying to fight off a smile. But Jake's expression remained serious. No, of course not, Uncle Ken. I've been here with Aunt Iris all the time. We've been talking and grilling sausages together. We haven't left the camp. Have we, Aunt Iris? Iris nodded. Jake and I have been frying the sausages together and having a nice chat. We haven't left the camp. I'll be damned. It's as if I'm losing my mind,"
said Ken, wiping away the sweat from his brow, and staring back at the woods, looking distinctly befuddled.
"If neither of you left the campsite, and my basket was filled with firewood that I didn't put in there, who put it in there? We're in the middle of nowhere, are we not? There is no one around for many miles. Firewood doesn't grow a pair of legs and put itself in the basket, does it?"
"Don't fret about it, love," said Iris. "Maybe the woodland fairies did it for you," she teased. "I'm sure you must be hungry. How about I dish you up some sausages and scrambled eggs? And then you can take Jake fishing. Won't that be fun? Jake has never been fishing before, so he's looking forward to his first fishing adventure, aren't you, Jake?" "I certainly am."
"Of course I'll take you fishing, son," said Ken. "I'm looking forward to it myself. But right now my stomach is doing all the talking,"
he said, looking at the sausages hungrily, and quickly forgetting about the mystery with the firewood. It was after breakfast that Iris watched Jake and her husband saunter off to the further end of the lake together, armed with their fishing tackle, and Iris was pleased to see how happy they both looked. She really enjoyed her private little chat with Jake, and had been amazed how he'd opened up to her about his late mother. She realised that having her nephew living there was actually an enjoyable experience. She was quite shocked by the maternal feelings that had risen up within her when Jake had burst into tears. All she had wanted to do was to swaddle her arms around him and shelter him from the big bad world. What was wrong with her, she wondered? Why was she becoming so soppy? She was beginning to realise that maybe being a mother might actually be a rewarding job after all. So there we are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.